Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Hey. I want to thank everybody who joined the Shiur yesterday. If you didn't join the Shiur yesterday, you can still watch it online. It'll be up on our site later today. It's also on Facebook, as was done Facebook Live, so you can always watch the video there. So thank you for all joining. It was an amazing event, and we appreciate everybody's participation. Another announcement: the Zoom. Okay, the Shiur will go on as normal in the summer, right? No break from Daf Yomi. The Shiur will be up every day. But it'll be up a little bit earlier than usual, a few hours before, by 6 o'clock in the morning Israel time. So if you listen late at night in some other, in a different time zone, like in America or something, you might catch the next day's daf earlier. You might say, what happened here? So it'll be up a little earlier than usual. So beginning tomorrow, there's still regular time, but after that, for the next 5 weeks, there won't be a Zoom class. Okay, sorry. The Zoom class will resume only at the end of August, around the 18th or 19th of August. I think the 19th. So I'll keep you posted on the Zoom WhatsApp group. If you're not part of the Zoom WhatsApp group, you can join. It should be on the site. You can find it and get updates. So again, there won't be Zoom, but there will be regular shiurim. Every day I'll be putting up the shiur. I'll be doing it on American time the night before, and it'll go up in the morning in Israel and late at night in America. Okay. It could be because of the links, the daily links every day. If you're on the WhatsApp groups where you get the link every day, it might go out a bit later than usual. I don't know if someone will be up as early as 6 to be sending it out Israel time, and I'll be up late at night to send it. But if it might come in later, but the daf should be up there earlier. So also just note that if you want to listen earlier before you get a link by WhatsApp, it will likely be there. Okay, it should be up every day by 6 a.m. Israel time. Okay, let's get started with our daf. A bit of a different type of daf, I would say. It's a little bit, all of a sudden, we're going to enter the realm of the mikdash. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the beginning of our Masechet started out just like the beginning of Eruvin, where we were talking about 20 amot and the size and the 20 cubits and then the 10 tefachim, which are also the same measurements used for Sukkah, and even some of the sugya was verbatim what it said in the beginning of Eruvin about why is the language different in Eruvin and in Sukkah. And Eruvin, it tells you how to fix it, and in Sukkah it tells you it's disqualified. But then right away on Daf Bet in Eruvin, it went right into the 20 cubit height comes from the mikdash, from the temple, okay, and the Mishkan, and they start comparing. Here, it's very interesting. The Mishkan and the mikdash come up, but only in the 10 tefachim. It didn't mention it in regards to the 20 amot. I don't know why. I'm just putting it out there. There's a bunch of things to them. I don't really know why the sugya goes like this, but the fact is it doesn't mention it with the 20 cubits, even though it clearly is the same 20 cubits that we learned in Eruvin that also connects to the Beit HaMikdash, but it only talks about it here when it gets to the 10 tefachim, the 10 handbreadths. So that's what we're going to start today at the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet. Okay, today's daf is sponsored by the Schuster family of Edison in memory of Sharona's mother, Sandra Shimoff, and Ozer's grandmother, Malka Schuster. We're starting from the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet. She'ena gvoha 10 tefachim. So if a sukkah is not 10 tefachim high, it's disqualified. Minalam, where do we get this from? Itmal, it was said that Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chaviva Matnu, the four of them taught the following. Now, before we get to what they teach, we get some line, which clearly must have been added to the text of the Gemara later. Somebody put in this note, Bekule Seder Moed, and all of Moed, right, which is what we're in, which is from Shabbat, Eruvin, Psachim, all those. In all of Seder Moed, Kol Kihai Zuga, whenever you see this pair together, it's not actually a pair of two, it's a pair of four. You see those four names? Chalufe Rabbi Yochanan Ma'ale Rabbi Yonatan. It's not really Rabbi Yochanan. Take out Rabbi Yochanan, switch with Rabbi Yonatan. You can see why people would confuse those names. They sound very similar. And it's just a mistake. Rabbi Yochanan didn't talk with those people about Moed issues. Whenever those four appear in an issue related to holiday within Seder Moed, well, it's really Rabbi Yonatan and not Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, that's an aside. Now let's get to what they said. Aron Tisha v'kaporet tefach harei kan asara. How do we get to this 10 tefachim measure? So the first part of today is going to be to learn it from the Aron and the Kaporet. Soon we're going to reject this and learn it from somewhere else. But for a while, we're going to build this theory. It's learned out from the fact that the Aron was 9 tefachim high. How do we know that? We're going to see later, but the Aron, it says in the Torah, it's 1.5 cubits, 1.5 cubits high. Now, cubit is 6 tvachim, 6 handbreadths. So 6 plus another 3, a half, 1.5, gets you to 9. And the kaporet was a tefach. How do we know the kaporet was a tefach? We're going to have a whole long discussion about it today, where we learned that from. It's not clear from the Torah that the kaporet was a tefach high. Okay, what is the aron and the kaporet? We've seen this a few times. Okay, in today's pictures, I'm going to pull up the pictures. You'll see though that it's not the best picture of the kaporet, but here's the aron, okay, which is this box. If you remember, we learned this in Yoma. So if you were in Yoma, you know, we learned about this box of the aron, that inside it, we talked about this at the Siyum last night, right? We even had the broken tablets on the tablet. And then on top of it, you see, it's hard to see in this picture so well. Maybe I'll zoom in a little. Right? On top of it was this almost like a covering that was a tefach thick that went the whole length and width of the aron. So that is called the kaporet. Okay. So now we're going to say the aron plus the kaporet were 10 altogether. The 9 tvachim, the 9 handbreadths of the aron plus the 1 of the kaporet. And now we're going to say, okay, so what does that have to do with anything? So what if that was the height? Well, K'tiv, it says, no'adati lecha sham v'dibarti itcha me'al kaporet. Shem says to Moshe, I'm going to appear before you there, and I'm going to speak to you from above the kaporet, which means where is God going to speak to Moshe from? From above this 10 tvachim space. Why? Well, Vitanya, there's a brayta that says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Me'olam lo yarda shechina lamata, v'lo alu Moshe ve'Eliyahu lamarom, shene'emar hashamayim shamayim la'Hashem va'aretz natan l'bnei adam. I want to start first with quoting the verse. It's a very famous verse from Sefer Tehillim, from Psalms, and it basically says that the Aretz is ours, the Shamayim is God's, and God doesn't enter into our territory, and we don't enter into God's territory. So when it says that God spoke to Moshe from above the kaporet, it's to say the reason he spoke to him from above the kaporet is because God doesn't come into man's domain. What's man's domain? The aron and the kaporet. How much is that? 10 tvachim. That's how we get that a domain of a person, which means a mechitza, a wall, a space, a sukkah, all of those things that relate to Shabbat, Eruvin, Rishuyot, domains, and sukkah, which is a place where a person can temporarily live, has to be a minimum height of 10 tvachim. That's the space of man that God doesn't come into. Not only does God not come into the space of man, but man can't go, you might think that's pretty obvious, we don't ever go up to the heavens, but man can't go up into the heavens either. Now, why do they say this? So what they say? The Shechina never came all the way down to the ground. It was always above the aron and the kaporet, which was 10 tvachim off the ground. And who are the people who we know who went up to the heavens, so to speak? Moshe and Eliyahu. Well, they're going to tell you, no, really, lo alu Moshe ve'Eliyahu. Remember, when Eliyahu dies, he doesn't really die, right? That's why he always appears in stories, because you never really see him die. He goes up to the sky. He's taken away in a storm to the sky. And Moshe goes up when he goes to receive the 10 commandments, or the Torah. So it says, so there you have it. Below Yarda. So now the Gemara is going to start questioning. What do you mean? Don't we have proof that the Shechina came down and the Moshe and Eliyahu went up? And we go one by one and question this. Below Yarda Shechina Lamata, we're going to bring several verses that seem to indicate that the Shechina does go down to earth. Bhakti Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. God came down on Mount Sinai when he gave us the Torah. So what do they answer? And this is going to be the mantra we're going to see throughout. Every time we're going to answer the same thing. When it says God came down on Har Sinai, it doesn't mean he actually came onto the mountain. He was hovering 10 tvachim above, 10 handbreadths above. There's always this space within the 10 tvachim of the ground. That's man's domain. God will never enter into this domain. This reminds me, by the way, I don't know if you're thinking about this, but for me, it reminds me of the story at the end of Parshat Breshit, where it talks about that the Bnei Elohim came down from the heavens and they mated with the Benot Adam. And there was this terrible travesty that happened because the Bnei Elohim are not supposed to intermingle with the Benot Adam. They're not supposed to marry them. There's separate domains in the world. There's Shamayim and there's Aretz, and they're not supposed to mix. And it's this horrible thing when that mixes. So here also, I think it's getting to that similar idea that there's boundaries. Even God keeps within boundaries, which is fascinating to think about, right? The way what they're trying to say here. Again, what this has to do with Sukkah, I'm going to leave this as what we call chomer lamachshava, food for thought. Okay, why this is here and what you can make of this and connect it to Sukkah is a good question. So now they're going to say, v'haktiv, another verse, va'amdu raglav bayom hahu al har hazeitim. This is in Zechariah. It's talking about some point in the future, right, in the world to come, when Mashiach comes, around that time, what will happen? God's feet will stand on Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives. That sounds like God's feet are going to stand on the Mount of Olives and he's going to come into our realm. So again, the Gemara is going to answer, he's going to hover over it at a height of 10 tefachim. He's not going to come into our territory. So, okay, we understand God. Now, it's very interesting to think that God limits where he goes, right? It's almost God keeps his distance from us. He won't come so close. But what about Moshe and Eliyahu? Didn't they go up? Let's go one by one. Moshe went up to God. Sounds like he went up. So again, they say lamata me'asara. He was within 10 tefachim of the heavens. He went up, but he didn't go all the way up, which is interesting the way you imagine this. The world is, right, there's Shamayim, there's Aretz, there's 10 tefachim, right, of Shamayim, there's 10 tefachim of Aretz, and everything else is kind of this no man's land, or everyone's man's land, really. In other words, man can go up, or humans can go up, and God can come down into that in-between space. So there is some space where they can both be, but they each can't cross over, right? There's a certain space that's designated just to the heavens and just to the earth. Okay. So when Moshe went up, but he didn't get that far. Soon we'll question that even more. But now they're going to move to Eliyahu. Eliyahu went up in a storm to the heavens. That's how he dies. Again, he went up, but he didn't go all the way up. He stayed within 10. But this pasuk seems to really indicate that Moshe went all the way up. And it's not a pasuk that describes Moshe in terms of when we have the story of Moshe, but it's a pasuk in Iyov, which describes, it's talking about Moshe. And it says, Ma'achez Pnei Kisei, he touched the seat of God, okay, the Kisei HaKavod as we call it. Pershaz alav anano, and God spread his anan, like his presence on Moshe. So va'ama Rabbi Tanchum, and Rabbi Tanchum learns from this verse, Melamed sheperas Shaddai, that God spread miziv shchinato va'anano alav. He spread from his presence and his cloud on, which by the way reminds us of the clouds of how God covered us in clouds in the desert, and that's one of the things that Sukkah is reminiscent of. So you could see this connection between the holiday of Sukkot. So God spread his Shekhinah on top of Moshe. It sounds like Moshe was up there in the heavens with God. So how could you say he wasn't? So again, they say, no, lamata me'asara, right? It was within 10. God, I guess, lowered down a little bit to that area where God can be, and right to the area where everyone can be. Moshe went up there, and that's where he did it. But the Gemara says, but wait, but it said he grabbed onto the chair of God, the throne of God. How could he have done that if he wasn't within where God was living, dwelling, right? Whatever that means. So the Gemara answers, a very creative answer. The chair came down a little bit, okay? It didn't stay in its place, and Moshe grabbed onto it while it was in that lower realm. So the chair, the throne moved out from its abode, and that was what Moshe was grabbing onto, but there's no way that Moshe went up into the heavens. So far, we started with the Aron and the Kaporet were 10. Once you assume they're 10, which now we're going to have to say, how did we get to the fact that they're 10? That's what we're going to establish in the next section of the Gemara. But assuming at this point, we assume they're 10. God spoke to Moshe from above. That must mean that God wouldn't come into the domain of man. 10 is domain of man. That's why 10 is the minimum shiur for Sukkah. This has to do with, again, laws of mechitza, anything that's a partition, which was relevant for Shabbat and Eruvin and domains, all issues of domain that all go down to the 10 tefachim, and that comes from the Aron and the Kaporet. In a little while, we're going to reject this answer and bring a different answer, or also we're going to suggest maybe there's a problem with this answer, and we're going to bring, according to some opinions, you'll see that we're not going to end up necessarily sticking with this answer. But for now, the Gemara is going to say, okay, Bishlama Aron Tisha. I get the 9 tefachim. Okay, when you're trying, now we took it as a given that the Aron and the Kaporet are 10 handbreadths tall. So we say we understand the Aron is 9. That makes a lot of sense, although at the end of the daf, we're going to actually suggest that that's only according to one opinion. Okay, but according to at least one opinion, the Aron is Tisha. Dichtiv, Vasu Aron Ateshitim, make the Aron out of this wood, the shitim wood. Amatayim v'chetzi orko, v'amar v'chetzi rochbo, 1.5 cubits long, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, v'amar v'chetzi komato, and 1.5 cubits tall. Now, 1.5 cubits is how much? Each cubit is 6 handbreadths. 6 plus 3, half an amma, would be 9. Ela kaporet tefach minalim. But how do we know that that cover over the aron called the kaporet was a tefach? How do you know it was 1 handbreadth? Ditani Rabbi Chia. Now, the kaporet, we're going to see this in a minute. It tells you in the Torah that it's 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide. That is told to us, just like the aron, and that makes sense because it sat right on the aron and had the exact same dimensions. But it doesn't say how tall it was. It just said how long, the length and the width. Doesn't say the height. So that's going to be our question. So they say, how do we know this? Lost my place. Ela kaporet tefach minam. So now they say, Ditani Rabbi Chanina. Kol hakelim she'asa Moshe natna behen Torah midat orkan midat rochban midat komatan. All the vessels that Moshe built in the Mishkan. He didn't really do the building, but he was the one in charge of building them. Right? He was on top of it, but Bezalel really built them and his people. But the Torah told you exact measurements, length, width, and height, except for the kaporet. Kaporet, midat orka, midat rachban. That's not, as I said, we get the length, we get the width, but midat komata lo natna. It doesn't tell you how tall it is. So how do we know that it's a tefach? The Gemara says, let's learn from the smallest kli that there is. What is that? Now we're talking about the shulchan. I'll pull up a picture. The shulchan was the table in the temple, and the table had a mizgeret, a border that went around it. You see 2 parts of this mizgeret. One is this border that goes around the table. We're in picture 30. And on top of that was a zer, which was a little decorative element that looked a little bit like a crown. Here they doesn't exactly look like a crown, but it had this crown look to it. It's called a zer saviv. So we said we're going to learn it from the mizgeret. Now, how do we know what the thickness of this mizgeret was? Mal halan tefach afkan tefach. So there it was a tefach. How do we know? Because it says, Vasita lo mizgeret tofach saviv. It says it was a tofach saviv. Tofach means it was a tefach. Okay, so now we have, this is a tefach, and therefore by us it's also a tefach. To which the Gemara says, why are we learning it from there? V'neilaf mikelim gufayu. Why don't we learn it from a different one of the utensils? Most of those had a height of 1.5 cubits or something like that. So why are we learning it from this mizgeret? Tafastim aruba lo tafasta, tafastim wa tafasta. We're going to have a few connections to the end of Masechet Yoma. If you remember, we had this whole thing with the measurements in Yoma. And we said, why don't we learn it from something bigger? And they say, no, because when we go by shiurim, requisite amounts, we always go by the smaller. So if we have, this is the smallest kli that there is, even though it's not exactly a kli, and we're going to talk about that soon, because it's just this frame that went around the kli. It wasn't, but it went around the table, right? The table, just to make it clear, we're talking about the table on which the showbread was placed. So they say when it comes to measurements, requisite amounts, we're always going to go by the smaller amount. So therefore, we're going to say it was tefach and not, let's say, an amah v'chetzi or something, right? 1.5 cubits. So then they say, oh, you're looking for small? I'll give you a better small thing to learn from. V'neilach mitzitz. Why don't we learn it from the tzitz? This was the thing that went over the forehead of the kohen, which we're going to learn about right now. Detanya, tzitz domek kimin tas shel zahav. We also learned about this a lot before, as it atones for sins, the tzitz. Tzitz domek kimin tas shel zahav. It was like a golden sheet of gold. V'rachav shtei etzbaot. It was 2 fingers wide. That really means high, okay, because it sat on this thing. It went 2 fingers. Now, 2 fingers is half a tefach, because a tefach is a fist, which is basically 4 fingers. It was half a tefach. So here you have a kli, a utensil that was half a tefach and not a tefach. So if you're going by the smallest, Why don't we say that the kapora was only half a tefach like the tzitz? In the meantime, they already quoted this brighter. They're going to quote some more things about the tzitz. It was mukaf me'ozen la'ozen. It went from one ear to the other ear. It was this forehead thing that went on his forehead from ear to ear. V'katuv alav shnei shitin. It was written in 2 rows. Yud He milamala v'kodesh lamed milamata. It said kodesh la on the bottom line, Hashem the Yud Ke Vav Ke on the top line. Okay, which is a little bit strange because you would think it would read straight. And in fact, if you've seen pictures of it, most of the pictures show it in one line, which we'll see why in a minute, because there's a different opinion that says it was one line, Kodesh La Hashem. But there's a debate actually about this opinion, about it being Yud He was on top and Kodesh Lamed on the bottom. Was the whole thing center justified? Was the bottom line right justified and the top line left justified, or was it the reverse, that the bottom line was left justified and the top line was right justified? There's all different opinions about this exactly, how exactly these 2 rows were supposed to have looked. In any case, that's the opinion here. What are you talking about? I saw it in Rome. The Romans took away all the temple possessions, and Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Yossi said, I saw it in Rome. We've seen a line like this before. And I saw it written all in 1 row. It wasn't in 2 rows. It was in 1 row. In any case, the point was that the tzitz was 2 etzba'ot wide. Why don't we say that the kaporet was 2 etzba'ot wide, which would be half a tefach? So the answer is, danim klimi kli ve'ein danim klimi tachshit. We want to learn about a vessel that was the kaporet, which is on the aron, from the shulchan, from the frame around the shulchan, and not learn it from something that was just an ornament. The tzitz was an ornament of the Kohen. It wasn't a vessel in the temple. It was something the Kohen wore. It's something different. You're not going to learn one from the other. Okay, so if you want to learn kli from kli, and we also want to get to the smallest, the Gemara suggests, why don't you learn nelach mizel? What about that zer that went around the table that I showed you just before? Right, there was this trim. It was this nice gold trim that went around the border of, on top of this mizgeret. To Amar Mar. Now, it doesn't say in the Torah what the requisite amount, how much that had to be, not the requisite amount, I shouldn't say that, but it doesn't say how tall this zer was. But the rabbis learned, to Amar Mar, zer mashu. It just had to be any small amount. It didn't have a certain amount, a certain thickness that it needed to be. So if that's the case, let's go back to our mizgeret. And let's say, let's not learn it from the mizgeret. You want to learn it from a kli, and we want to get to the smallest, because tafasta muat tafasta. We want to go with the smallest amount always. So let's learn it from the zer. The zer was nothing. It just had to be a little bit. Why don't we say the kaporet was very, very thin? So danim klimi, kli ve'ein danim klimi hechsher kli. The zer was just decorative. It wasn't really part of the vessel. It wasn't part of the utensil. It wasn't part of the table. It was just a decorative element. You don't learn something that's important, the kaporet, which functioned as the cover of the aron, top of the aron. You can't learn that from a decorative element. To which the Gemara says, well, what do you think the mizgeret, that frame was? Don't you think the frame was just decorative? Mizgeret nami hechsher klihu. Why do you think there was this frame around the table? It wasn't functioning in any purpose. Well, maybe it was. They say mizgarto lemata haita. Okay, let's go back to our pictures. So our pictures show us 2 possible tables. There's going to be a debate. Was the mizgeret above or was the mizgeret below? Above what or below what? The table itself. The table itself, we mean, right, the top of the table. So if we say, and that's this picture 30 that we've been looking at all along, the mizgeret was lemata. That means, right, let's go down from the bottom. We have legs of the table. On top of the legs was this base, this frame, and on the frame sat the table. That means that the frame was not decorative, it was functional. It was part of the kli. That makes a lot of sense. But, so they say the mizgeret was lamata, and that resolves our issue. That's why the zer was just decorative. We're not going to learn from there that it was a little bit. We're going to learn from the mizgeret that was a whole tefach, because the mizgeret was underneath the table. But that's only if you hold that way. This moves us to picture 31. In picture 31, we see that the table sat on top of the legs. That was the whole table. On top of the table came this mizgeret, this frame, which means that in this picture, they don't show you the zer in this picture. Obviously, it also had a little zer at the top, this little crown-like thing. But what they want to show you here is that the mizgeret sat on top of the table and it was only a decorative element. So if that's the case, then no, we can't learn what we're trying to learn. So they say, if you say that it was just a decorative element, and then we can't even learn from there. And then we're back to square one. So what do they tell us? Now, there's a big difference between the mizgeret and the zer. What's the difference? The zer was not written in the Torah how big it has to be, but the measurements of the mizgeret were written in the Torah. We saw that. Asita lo mizgeret tofach saviv. Tofach means it was a tefach. So they say, Ela danim davar shenatna bo Torah midah midavar shenatna bo Torah midah. The kaporet itself had measurements in the Torah. Now, it's true, it was missing the height measurement, but it did have the length and the width. So they're going to say, when we want to learn something that had the length and the width, and we're just missing one measurement, that's called something that was given its measurements by the Torah. So when we want to learn what the measurements are for the missing measurement, we're going to learn it from something whose measurements were given by the Torah, which is the mizgeret. But we're not going to learn it from something that the Torah didn't even give a measurement for. The Torah didn't give any measurement for the zer, and it didn't give any measurement for the tzitz. Those were all learned by the rabbis. That the zer was 2 fingers, and the tzitz was 2 fingers, and the zer was just a little bit. Therefore, we're not going to learn from them because they've never said it in the Torah. So we end up concluding that either, where do we learn the right now? Okay, I shouldn't say concluding because we're still in the middle. But at this stage, what have we done? Let's just review from the beginning of the daf to make order. We started with, how do we know 10 tefachim? We learned it from the Aron and the Kaporet. And we said, right, that God only spoke to man above. Then we had all these questions. Does God never came down to earth? And did man never go up to heavens? Okay, we resolved all that. Then we said, how do we know that it's really 10? So the Aron we know, the Kaporet, how do we know? Well, we learned the Kaporet's a tefach from the mizgeret. Why the mizgeret and not anything else? Because it's the smallest of all. But why the mizgeret and not anything that's smaller than there? Because those measurements were rabbinic in nature and not by Torah. And therefore, since the Torah did give measurements for the Kaporet, just didn't give us the measurement for the height, we'd rather learn it from something whose measurements are specified in the Torah. And therefore, we learn it from the Shulchan. Either we say, because the Shulchan is a kli, because the mizgeret of the Shulchan, the frame, is actually a utensil, and then it makes sense. So that's a vessel versus the others aren't a vessel. Or if you say it's not, it's just decorative, still we'd rather learn it from there than from the other decorative elements, because those decorative elements don't actually have an amount, a measurement from the Torah. But now we're going to give a second answer to the kaporet being a tefach. Maybe we don't learn it from the mizgeret. Rav Huna Amar Mehacha, he had a different way of learning that it's a tefach. And again, we're going to connect back to Yoma. The pasuk in our favorite parak, Vayikra Tet Zayin, which we learned very well in the last Masechet, all about the Avodat Yom Kippurim. It says in pasuk Yud Daled, V'lakach midam hapar. Remember, he takes the bull's blood. V'hizah be'etzba'o, when the Kohen Gadol is in Kodesh HaKodeshim, in the Holy of Holies, he takes his finger and he puts his finger in the blood. Al pinei hakaporet kedma. He does it toward the face of the kaporet. He uses the word pinei, face, even though there's no face on the kaporet. So what does it mean? Al pinei kaporet kedma. It's going to teach us the panim of the kaporet, the face of, right? You sometimes use face in a different meaning. The face of the kaporet. Now, what does this have to do with the tefach? Ein panim pachot mi tefach. Take the smallest newborn baby. Newborn baby's face could be about the size of a tefach. So therefore, we learn from the word pinei that said panim, there's a face of the kaporet. It must be no smaller than the size of a baby's head, face. So that's going to be a tefach. Okay, well, if you're going to say face, and it's the size of a face, and a face will say, like a baby's face is a tefach, why don't you say, and this also is going to remind you of Yoma, Ve'ema ke'ape debar yochani. Remember we talked about this gigantic bird when we were talking about the requisite mounts. Again, they said, why don't we learn from this gigantic bird called the bar yochani? So they say, again, same thing we said before, tafasta meruba lo tafasta, tafasta mu'at tafasta. We're always going to go, if we have a face of this gigantic bird, and we have a face of a newborn baby, we're going to go with the smaller measurement, because again, with measurements, we always go by the smaller. Ve'ema ba'ape ditziporta. But wait, you want to find a small face? Take a small bird. Think about the face of a bird. It's way smaller than a tefach. You could forget about that gigantic bird. That's too big. We're always going to go with the smaller amount. But you could find a small bird and have a face. The zutartuva, it's even smaller. So they say, and therefore it will be less than a tefach. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Avhuna Pnei Pnei Gamal. He learned Gzera Shava, meaning taking two words that appear in two different places and learning one from the other. It never, basically, in other words, it never says the word panim of a bird in the Torah anywhere. And where does it say panim? By humans. So here you have it, where K'tiv el Pnei Kaporet, that was our verse. Pnei Kaporet, we're going to see Kaporet is panim, and we said it's the face of a human. Uktiv hatam me'et Pnei Yitzchak Aviv. We're going to quote two verses now, which have to do with Yaakov and Esav. The first one is this one, which is after Yitzchak gives Yaakov the blessing, and then, right, thinking it was Esav, and then as Yaakov's leaving, me'et Pnei Yitzchak, it says, v'yatzo yatsa Yaakov me'et Pnei Yitzchak Aviv. He goes out from the face of his father, ve'esav achiv ba mitzedeo, and Esav comes back from his hunting exactly at that moment. So what do you see here? Me'et Pnei Yitzchak Aviv. That's human panim. So therefore, we're going to learn human. We're going to learn the Pnei Kapor from the human panim, and that gets us back to our tefach. So again, we have one track which was to learn from the Shulchan. This is the second track. We didn't reject that. We're just bringing an alternative, which is Rav Huna suggests we learn it from Pnei Kapor. To which the Gemara is going to continue to ask questions. Why don't you learn it from the face of either God or angels? As it says, Dichtiv, Kiraot Pnei Elohim B'tirtzeni. Also Yaakov and Esav. This is the end of that section where when Yaakov goes to make amends with Esav after that whole issue that happened, right? And he stole the blessing and they got all Esav wanted to kill him and he runs off. And then at the end, after he builds a family with Lavan, he comes back and he brings a gift to Esav. And he says to him, he says in Breshit Lamed Gimel Pasuk Yud, he says, Al na'im matzati chen be'einecha, v'lakachta minchati, right? If I find favor in your eyes, you will take my gift. Ki al ken ra'iti panecha kirot pnei Elohim v'tirtzeni. Because when I see your face, it's like seeing the face of an angel or seeing the face of God. There you see panim with God or angel, which we assume, because the way we view God or angels as greater than man, must be much bigger than a tefach. So why don't we go with that? You probably already know what the answer is going to be. It's true we have panim when it comes to God or angels, which are much larger, but we also have panim in the Torah, which relates to humans' faces. We're going to take the smallest one of that, which is a baby, and we're going to say that's the measurement, that's a tefach. We always go by the smaller amount. So there you have it. Now they say, well, let's find another place where panim appear, where also it would end up being smaller. What would that be? V'nelach mikruv, the cherubs that were on the aron. Dichtiv, ela kaporet yiyu pnei kruvim. There, what does it say? Right? On the kaporet, you have the kruvim, right? And they'll be facing the kaporet. The pnei hakruvim, they have faces. Now, at this point, the Gemara assumes, at least this is what the Mefarshim explain, they assume right now that the kruvim, we don't really know what the cherubs, what shape they were. They're assuming that they were more like a bird-like thing. And why birds? Because it says they had kanafayim, wings. What has wings? Birds. Now, if it's a bird, chances are it's a small bird, in which case the face of the kruvim were going to be less than a tefach. So why don't we say that? Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Gemiri, ein pnei kruvim prutim mitefach. We have a tradition that the face of the cherubs were a tefach, or they weren't less than a tefach. So then you could learn it from there, but you would learn the exact same thing. So theoretically, you could learn it from the pasuk of Yaakov, face, or you could learn it from the pasuk about the cherubs. They were also a tefach. Rav Huna, Rav Huna also learns it from there, and he could also learn it from there. Umay kruv, and what's a kruv? Amar Rabbi Abahu kiravya. What does the word kruv mean? It's split in two. It's like ki, it's like Ravya. What's Ravya? Shekem bevavel korim liyenuka Ravya. Okay, Ravya, and this comes up, a Rubia and things like that. It's a young person, like a young baby or a young child. So ki Ruvya is like a child. And that's where they learned that the cherubs had the face of a young child. And it wasn't a bird or something like that. It was actually the face of a child. And that's how we get that it's really one and the same, right? You're going to learn it from a face of a human. It's also like learning it from the face of a cherub, because a cherub was like a human and like a child. And there you have your tefach, whether you learn from there. So again, we have one track, which was to learn from the mizgeret, that frame around the table, the shulchan. The other is to learn it from the pnei kaporet, as if the kaporet has a face. Face is a tefach, which we learn either from pnei Yaakov, right? And pnei Yitzchak Aviv, that Yaakov leaves from the face of his father, or the issue of the panim of the cherubs, the kruvim. Now they say, wait a minute. Elame'ata dechtiv, you want to say that the cherubs were human? That doesn't really work with this verse in Yechezkel. It says, dechtiv pnei ha'achad pnei ha'kruz, u'pnei ha'sheni pnei adam. There's this image you see is one face is the face of a cherub and one is the face of a human. That sounds like cherub is not human. Otherwise, they wouldn't list them separately. Hainu kruv, hainu adam. You can't, right? Then it would be the one and the same. So what do they answer? No, it could be. The kruv was a small face. Like one looked very young and one was older. Okay, one was like the face of a human. It also was a human, the cherub, but it was a smaller one. Okay, that so far is our proof. So let's go back. We proved it basically. What we did in the last section was to prove how do we know the kaporet was the tefach. Once we had that shulchan or panim, pnei kaporet, once we have that proof, now we know that the aron was 9, the kaporet was 10, altogether 10 tefachim. God spoke to man, to Moshe from above there. That means that the whole space, right, that's human space, the human domain is 10. Your minimum height per sukkah is 10. That all sounds good, except the Gemara is going to now question this. If this is the domain of man, and it includes the aron and the kaporet, then theoretically, if we want to build a sukkah within this, what did we say? The sukkah space has to be 10, and the schach goes above that 10. But if we're talking about a dwelling for a human, and the human space is 10, it should be 10 including the schach, not 10 and then the schach. And therefore, everything we learned now is basically rejected. We don't learn it from the aron and the kaporet, because if we learned it from the aron and the kaporet, you would learn 10 including the schach, just like the kaporet is part of the cover of the aron, and that's within the 10. So therefore, they say we're going to learn it elami beit olamim gamar. We're going to learn it from the Beit HaMikdash. How so? For this, we have to build a few different stages. So it's actually interesting. We're going to learn it from the aron and the kaporet, but a little bit not from the aron and the kaporet, but the space above it. That's really where we're going to learn it. So it's similar in the sense that we're still learning it. It's very interesting, also coming right off of Masechet Yoma, where that's in the Holy of Holies and it's the most holy place. That's where we're learning about space from, right? The space is being learned from the most holy of places. We're still going to learn it from the most holy of places, but instead of the space of the aron and the kaporet, we're going to learn it from the space above it. So, elami beit olamim gamar. How so? Dichtiv. V'abayit asher bana Shlomo hamelech Shlomo laHashem 60 amar orko, ve'eschim rochbo u'shloshim amar komato. The sanctuary that was in the temple that Shlomo built was 60 amma long. We also had a whole discussion about this. It was 20 amma wide, and it was 30 in height. So now we're going to talk about the 30 of height. That's what's going to interest us. Uchtiv. The cherubs in the time of the temple were 10 amot high, and they stood on the ground, as opposed to the ones in the Mishkan, which stood above the Aron. These stood on the ground. There were these two very tall cherubs. They stood on the ground. Vitanya. Okay, each one was 10 amot off the ground. Where does that take them in terms of height of the 30 amma of height? So they took up, right? They stood at, or the top of the cherubs was a third of the height of the Beit HaMikdash. That's what you need to know from there. Vitanya, and there's a writer that says, Ma matzinu bebeit olamim kruvim b'shlish habayit hem omdim. Just like in the Beit HaMikdash, they got up to a third of the height of the temple. Mishkan nami kruvim b'shlish habayit hem omdim. When it came to the Mishkan, in the temporary one, right, which had all different measurements, the cherubs must have also reached a third of the height of the room. So, how so? Mishkan Kamahavis. So here, let's pull up the picture. How tall was the Mishkan? So the Mishkan, here, The Mishkan was, let me make it a little smaller. Okay, here we go. The Mishkan Kamahavet, Eser Amot. It was 10 Amot tall. Dichtiv, how do we know that? Because it says in the Torah, Eser Amot Orech HaKeresh. Okay, it was 10 Amot, the length of the krashim, the boards. This is these gold wall panels here that you see. Were 10 Amot high. Now, what are Amot to Tvachim? Kamahavet Lehu. Shitin Pushche. They were 60 Tvachim, because we said 6 Tvachim to an Amma, to a cubit. So 6 handbreadths to a cubit. So you get 60, right? 10 cubits is 60 handbreadths. Talte kamahavu. So what's a third of that? Eslim pushche, 20. So now we're going to see that the cherubs, the height of the cherubs that were over the Aron, stood at the height of 20 cubits. Sorry, not 20 cubits, 20 handbreadths. Dal asara da Aron v'kaporet. Now we already established in the beginning of the Shiur that the height of the Aron and the kaporet were 10. If that was 10 and the cherubs went up to 20, how tall were the cherubs? 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths. So pashalu asara. So there's 10 left. That's the height of these cherubs. Now, we want to get to what? We want to get to this height of 10 with the schach being on top, right? We want to say this domain of where the kruvim take up the space is parallel to the space of the sukkah with something above it, the schach being above it and not part of it. Because when you have the 10 of the Aron and the kaporet, the cover and all of that, everything's included in the 10. We want to have something that's above the 10. So now it says, they had wings that went above. Sochachim, notice the word here. Sochachim sounds like schach, right? What does it mean? What is schach? It's a cover. Here also, the wings covered. Sochachim, they made a cover, bekanfehen, with their wings, al hakaporet. They covered the kaporet, right? They weren't directly above the kaporet, but they went above the kaporet. These wings were spread over the kaporet. Now, how much space is there between the wings and the kaporet? There's 10, because that's the space that the cherubs took up. So basically, the wings are above the height of 10, really 20, right? It's the 20 marker line. The first 10 tefachim, handbreadths, are the Aron and the kaporet. Above that, we have this space that the cherubs take up, and above that are the wings. To which the Gemara says, wait, right? And that's how you get that the schach has to be above the 10 tefachim. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Mimai digadfinu ilave reshayu kaime. How do you know that the wings are above the head of the kruvim? Dilma lahadi reshayu kaime. Maybe it's on the level of the heads, which again would mean that the covering is within the 10 tefachim. So Amar Rav Yaakov lemalaktiv. It says above. Sounds like above the head. Wait, once you're saying it's above the head, why do you assume it's exactly above the 10 tefachim marker, which would mean 10 tefachim and then wings? Maybe above means it was 15 tefachim above. How do you know? It doesn't say way above. It just says above, which sounds like right above. So that's how we get to our proof that the wings were above the cherubs. The cherubs had a height of 10. How do we know that? Because they went up to a third of the room, just like it was in the temple. Here, to get to a third of the room, you have the first 10 tefachim off the ground. Then you have another 10 tefachim, right, of the Aron and the kaporet. Then you have the other 10 tefachim of space, and above that you have the wings, and that's how you get all of that. However, so this is a different proof. The Aron and the kaporet are basically out, because if you go with Aron and kaporet, you would think that the schach would be within the 10. We need to get to the fact that the schach are above the 10. Here we have a perfect proof, because it even says sochachim, which sounds like schach, and you have 10, and you're still within the Kodesh Kodeshim. If you want to talk about that, we want to learn it from the holiest of holies, almost like the Sukkah is this holy, right? That's the abode of God, and this is the abode of man. You can start to make all these connections, right? And these maybe philosophical connections, metaphysical connections between house of God, house of man, etc. Right? Because that's where God's presence dwelled. So now they say, wait a minute. Rabbi Meir. This all works according to Rabbi Meir's theory. What did Rabbi Meir say? Da'amal kol amot hayu benoniot. All the amot in the temple were 6 tefachim amot, and that's how you would get to the Aron was 9 tefachim tall because it was 1 amah v'chetzi. However, Ella li Rabbi Yehuda da'amar. We've seen this position before. He said, amah shel binyan shishat tefachim. When you talk about the krashim and all the walls and everything of the building, that is true. They're all 6 tefachim cubits. However, v'shel kelim, when it talks about the vessels in the temple, chamisha, every amma in a vessel is only a 5 tvachim amma. That's going to mess up all our calculations. Ma'ika l'meimer, what are you going to say then? Aron b'kaporet kama havalahu. So how tall is the aron in the kaporet? If the aron is amma v'chetzi, so what's amma v'chetzi? 5 plus 2.5, right? You're going to get to, the kaporet is then 1 tefach, because that we learned out elsewhere. Timnayu palga, you're going to have 7.5 of the aron, 1 of the kaporet, you're going to get to 8.5 tvachim. If it's 8.5 tvachim, and now we're going to get to, how do we get right no matter what, we say that the kruvim were at a height of 20. The kruvim were at a height of 20, and the wings were above that, and the aron and the kaporet only got to 8.5, you're going to say that it's 11.5. Pashalu chad slei palga, you're going to end up with 11.5 tvachim. Ema sukkah dahabi chadu slei palga. So why don't you say the sukkah was 11.5 cubits, 11.5 tvachim, handbreadths. So now we reject this whole, we say, well, we don't reject it entirely. We say it only fits with Rabbi Meir. What's Rabbi Yehuda going to say? None of these calculations work out according to Rabbi Yehuda. So they say, Ela Rabbi Yehuda, Hilchata Gemira. We had this yesterday, a bunch of these halachot that are learned, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This one also is learned, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay? How do we know this? To Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. As Rabbi Chia bar Ashi says in the name of Rav, Shiurin, Chatzitzin, Umechitzin, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The requisite amounts, the chatzitzin, okay, what creates a barrier, okay, and okay, or Rashi says chatzitza posela b'mikveh, the fact that you can't have any barrier between you and the water, and mechitzin, what constitutes a mechitza, a wall, a domain, all of that is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that's how he gets it, not from what we've been saying all along. Okay, he has a whole different way of learning it, to which the Gemara says, wait a minute, shiurin de'oraita ninu, and this is a repeat sugya of things we've had before. We've asked this question before, so we've had this line before. How can you say shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Sinai? It says it explicitly in the Torah. Dichtiv eretz chita u'sorah, the famous pasuk where it talks about the shivat haminim that Eretz Yisrael is praised for. Eretz chita u'sorah, the gefen te'ena v'rimon, Eretz Yeshem v'nivash. Va'amar Rav Chanin, kol pasuk hazeh l'shiurim ne'emar. All of these are coming to tell you requisite amounts for different things. Chita, for example, Labayit Hamanuka, for a leprous house, which we're going to learn tomorrow, what we learn from there, what we learn from all the others, in which case they're d'oraita, and how could they possibly be halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which we're going to answer that tomorrow. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll meet up again tomorrow.